king. A king ruled a single kingdom, like England, France, or Castile, and had control over things like laws, taxes, and wars. But they weren't always all-powerful. Many had to negotiate with nobles who controlled large lands and wanted influence. Some kings like Louis managed to centralize power and make themselves absolute rulers. Others, like King John of England, got forced into signing documents like the Magna Carta, which limited their authority. Queens could also rule, either as the official monarch like Elizabeth I, or as regents for their children. Pope. The Pope was the head of the Catholic Church and one of the most powerful people in medieval Europe. He didn't just lead religious services, he could excommunicate kings, call for crusades, and settle disputes between rulers. Kings and emperors often had to listen to the Pope or risk losing support from their people. Emperor. An emperor was the top ruler, overseeing multiple kingdoms or territories at once. They had more power than a king, at least in theory. Some, like the Byzantine emperors, ran highly organized states with strong governments, while others, like the Holy Roman emperors, had to constantly deal with rebellious nobles who didn't always listen. Unlike kings, emperors ruled over multiple lands and were often seen as supreme leaders. They played huge roles in politics, religion, and warfare, shaping entire regions. Charlemagne, for example, united most of Western Europe, while Genghis Khan built one of the largest empires in history. Prince and princess. A prince was usually the heir to the throne. Trained from birth to take over one day, they were often given land or military roles to prepare them for leadership. A princess, while sometimes an heir herself, was usually used for political marriages that helped form alliances between kingdoms. Duke. A duke was one of the most powerful nobles, ranking just below a king. They ruled large areas called duchies, which often acted like mini-kingdoms. Some dukes had more power than weaker kings, especially if their lands were big or if the monarchy was unstable. A great example is William the Conqueror. He was just the Duke of Normandy until he invaded England in 1066 and made himself king. Marquess. A marquess was like a duke but with a more military-focused role. They ruled borderlands, called marches, which were often at risk of invasion. Because of this, they had to be strong military leaders and make sure their lands were well defended. Their role was important for protecting the kingdom from outside threats. Count. A count called an earl in England was in charge of a county, overseeing its administration, economy, and military. They collected taxes, enforced laws, and raised troops for the king when needed. Some counts, like the Counts of Barcelona, became so powerful that they acted like independent rulers. In many European kingdoms, counts were some of the most important nobles. Viscount. A viscount was like the second in command to a count, managing smaller areas within a county and handling local governance. They had less power than higher nobles, but they were still key figures in medieval society, often serving as local rulers when a count was away. Baron. A baron was the lowest-ranking noble, but still had control over land. They managed estates, collected taxes, and provided soldiers for the king's army. Though not as powerful as dukes or counts, barons played an important role in the feudal system. Some barons, like Simon de Montfort, even led rebellions against kings when they felt mistreated. Knight. A knight was a warrior who fought on horseback in exchange for land or wealth. They were supposed to follow the code of chivalry, which emphasized honor and loyalty, but many were just looking for riches and power. Knights played a key role in medieval warfare, leading troops and protecting their lords. Some, like Richard the Lionheart, became legendary warriors and even kings. Others, like the Knights Templar, formed military orders that went on crusades and ruled their own territories. Squire. A squire was a teenage boy training to become a knight. He worked closely with a knight, helping him in battle, taking care of his weapons and armor, and learning how to fight. Squires also had to learn good manners, diplomacy, and the code of chivalry because knights were supposed to be noble gentlemen, not just fighters. If a squire proved himself, usually by showing bravery in battle or completing an important task, he could be knighted. Page. A page was a young boy, usually around 7 to 14 years old, who served in a noble household as the first step toward becoming a knight. His job was mostly running errands, delivering messages, and learning proper manners. More importantly, he started basic training in sword fighting, horseback riding, and sometimes even reading and writing, which was rare back then. After proving himself, he could become a squire, moving one step closer to knighthood. Cardinal. Cardinals were high-ranking church officials who advised the Pope and helped run the church. Their most important job was electing new popes, But they also had a lot of power in politics. Many cardinals came from wealthy noble families, using their influence to gain high positions in both the church and government. Archbishop. An archbishop oversaw multiple dioceses and had authority over bishops in his area. He wasn't just a religious leader, he also advised kings and nobles and sometimes helped settle conflicts. Some archbishops, like those of Canterbury or Reims, were among the most powerful figures in their countries. Bishop. A bishop was in charge of a diocese, which included many local churches. He managed priests, church land, and money, making him both a spiritual leader and a powerful landowner. Some bishops even controlled armies and fought in wars, acting more like feudal lords than churchmen. Abbot. An abbot was the leader of a monastery, in charge of both its religious life and its finances. Monasteries often owned a lot of land and wealth, so abbots were influential figures. Some even advised kings or ruled territories on behalf of the church. Priest. A priest ran a local church, performing baptisms, marriages, funerals, and other religious services. He was the main religious leader in a village or town, providing spiritual guidance and sometimes acting as a teacher or scribe. Since many people couldn't read, priests were often the most educated members of their communities. Merchant. Merchants were traders who bought and sold goods, sometimes traveling long distances to do business. Craftsmen, on the other hand, made things like weapons, clothes, and furniture. They formed guilds to regulate prices, train apprentices, and protect their trades. Freeman. A freeman was a commoner who wasn't tied to a lord's land, meaning he could work for himself. Some freemen were farmers who owned their land, while others were craftsmen, merchants, or soldiers. They still had to pay taxes and might have to fight in the army, but they had far more rights than peasants or serfs. Yeoman. A yeoman was a free farmer who owned his land and wasn't under a lord's direct control. They were better off than peasants and often skilled with weapons. Many yeomen served as longbowmen in armies, playing key roles in battles like those of the 100 Years' War. Serf. A serf was a peasant who worked on a lord's land and wasn't allowed to leave without permission. They weren't slaves, but they had very few rights. In exchange for protection, they had to give a share of their crops or labor to the lord. Their lives were tough, spent mostly farming, caring for animals, and doing whatever work their lord demanded. Cottar. A cottar was a poor peasant who had little to no land of his own. He lived in a small cottage and worked for richer farmers or nobles in exchange for shelter and food. Cottars were at the bottom of the social system, barely scraping by. Slave. A slave had no rights and was considered property. While slavery wasn't as common in medieval Europe as in ancient times, it still existed in some areas, especially during wars. Slaves could be captured in raids, bought and sold, or forced into labor, making them the lowest class in society.